Hey, what's going on everybody? Alex with you here again. Thank you for dropping by. Thank you for tuning in. So today's video might be a little bit different than most of my other videos because a couple of weeks ago, a friend of my wife's asked if I could teach her son how to play chess. And although we sat down a couple of times at the table, ultimately I didn't feel like we had enough time for me to thoroughly teach him how to move the individual pieces and kind of give him an idea as far as the objective of the game. So they asked me if I could make a video instead, because as you guys may know, familiarity with the person and with the person's voice can go a long way in making that person comfortable in learning how to play chess. On that note, I felt like making a video on how to play chess for beginners is or may be beneficial to a lot of other people out there who may want to consider getting into the game. So although possibly this video may not be relevant to a lot of my subscribers at this time, I still think that making a video like this could be helpful to a lot of people out there. So with that being said, let's go ahead and jump in. I'm going to be using my demonstration roll-up board that you see here to show you guys how to move the individual pieces and kind of explain things a little bit better to you guys. Okay, so the classical variation of chess that we see before us is played with two players, where each of the players has a total of 16 pieces, 8 of which are pawns, and 8 of the other pieces are your major pieces. It's played on a 64 square board, 8 squares vertically, 8 squares horizontally, and on most of the boards, we notice that notation is included. Vertical notation is in numbers. It goes from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And the horizontal notation is in letters. It goes from A to H. This notation is very useful for when you're keeping notation of where you moved your pieces. A video that I can make separately on how to take notation if you guys are interested. As there is a lot of information that we need to cover in this video, I'm going to try to stay concise as possible. Prior to starting the game, the two opponents decide who's going to be the light side and who's going to be the dark side. A lot of times the decision is made randomly, or sometimes when you're playing with a friend, you guys can kind of decide who's going to play the white side. Either way, the light side always goes first, followed by the dark side. I'm going to start by introducing the individual pieces that we see before us. Both the opponent and you have a total of 16 pieces, 8 of which are pawns. The other 8 pieces are going to be our major pieces. We have the rook in the corner, we have the knight, the bishop, the king, queen, and then it kind of repeats itself as it did on this side. It sort of repeats itself. We have the bishop again, the knight, and the rook. So we can see we have 2 rooks, 2 knights, 2 bishops, a queen, and a king. Then we have 8 pawns that are sort of protecting the rest of the pieces in the beginning of the game. Each one of the pieces has a certain value, point system assigned to it, meaning how much the individual pieces cost, how valuable they are in the game. A pawn is worth 1 point. A rook is worth 5 points. Knight is worth 3 points, or some books say the knight is worth more like 3.2, but for the sake of simplicity, we'll say that it's worth 3 points. Bishop is worth 3 points as well, but actually more like 2.8. But we'll just go ahead and say that both the knight and the bishop, for the sake of simplicity, are worth 3 points. The king, you could say, is either worth 0 points or it's worth infinite points, because you can't technically capture the king in the game, but you can checkmate the king, and we'll get to that shortly. The queen is the most valuable piece besides the king, and it's worth 10 points. The point value system is actually very important when you are playing the game and you are deciding whether or not to capture the opponent's piece with your piece. For example, if you have the rook and it's worth 5 points, and you're thinking if you should go ahead and take the opponent's knight that's worth 3 points, whether or not it makes sense. This point system is not foolproof, meaning that perhaps in some situations taking a piece of lower value system may make more sense, and we'll get into that in some of the future videos. You would say, well, this piece is worth 3 points and my piece is worth 5 points, so maybe I should not consider doing the exchange. and, take the opponent's piece, because I would be down 2 points. Let's go ahead and start off by learning how to move the pawns. The pawn can move 1 square at a time during its game. So let's say that it was your turn to move. The pawn moves 1 square. The only exception to that rule is if the pawn has not yet moved and it's sitting in its initial position, a pawn or you can have a choice to move the pawn 2 squares in front. Now that you've made your move, you have to wait for your opponent to make a move. The opponent, say, decides to move their pawn also, then they move this way. Pawns capture the opponent's pieces diagonally. A pawn cannot capture the opponent's piece if it was in front of it, like this, but if there is another piece to your pawn, either on this square or on this square, you can capture that piece. You can take it off the board and put your piece there. The way that it works is that you take the opponent's piece and you put your piece there. The opponent's piece comes off the board, so in this case, it's on the floor. In this scenario, if it was white's turn to go, the white pawn can choose to capture either the pawn on the left side or the pawn on the right side. It cannot capture them both at once. It can only capture one or the other if it chooses to do so. One last detail I would like to mention as far as the movement of the pawns is the concept of en passant. The way that en passant is, basically, if you have the opponent's pawn this close, for example, to your beginning pawns here, and you decide to move your pawn out this far, you are basically taking away the opportunity for the opponent's pawn to take your pawn. So usually pawns move forward 1 square at a time, kind of like this. And so in that situation, the opponent, the dark piece, he can say, I'd like to take that pawn. So he takes it. And you say, okay, fine. However, in the situation where you took away that opportunity, you moved 2 pieces, and now the pawn can't take it anymore. So you sort of, in a way, kind of almost cheated this pawn from having the opportunity. The pawn, this pawn, can still take this pawn, like this. And you might say, wow, that's a little weird. And you take the pawn as if the light pawn was here. It only works when you haven't moved the pawn before and you're doing this sort of a 2-step move, as we see here. A lot of people forget about en passant when they're playing games, or they haven't been informed of the idea, or I'm not sure. But sometimes when you're playing a game and in the midst of the game, you have all your pawns up close to the opponent, and they're looking for ways to defend themselves, or they're looking for ways to attack you, and they move their pawn like this. Maybe, I don't know, maybe they had something like this going, and their bishop is there, and then they move to try to attack the bishop. They forget about the en passant. And then you do this move, and then there's silence. A lot of times, if I'm playing online, might be a 30-second lapse. They're trying to figure out what happened there. Sometimes people just forget. En passant is a very important concept to remember when it comes to the pawns. Besides the king, pawns arguably could be considered the most important structure or piece on the board, because if it was just one pawn that you had, that would be on one thing, but you have eight of those pawns, and 8 of those pawns can work together to create a barrier, to create a wall that could protect your pieces. In fact, they could create all kinds of problems and struggles for the opponent. Lastly, a pawn that reaches the opponent's side, and I mean the very back, without being captured, can be promoted. And promoted means it can be changed into any of the major pieces that you see before me here. So let's say, for example, that a pawn was here and it was your turn to go. And you've been moving this pawn throughout the game all the way you made it up here. If your pawn reaches the opponent's side, the 8th rank, now you have the opportunity to switch this pawn into any other piece that you want. A lot of times, the piece that people choose to switch is a queen, because the queen's the most powerful piece. So 95% of the time, people want to go with the queen. However, when the pawn reaches the 8th rank, it may or may not necessarily want to be converted into a queen. Sometimes converting into another piece may make a lot more sense. Although this is a hypothetical scenario, you could see in this particular situation, the king is trapped by all his other pieces. Although, this sometimes may or may not occur in the game, but if it does, for example, now going to a queen might be good. However, what if instead of the queen, we changed into a knight? Now the knight is attacking the king, and the king has nowhere to go. You've won the game. So although upgrading into a queen may seem like the obvious choice, in this particular situation, a smaller piece was the obvious choice. Now that we've covered a little bit about how the pawns move and capture, let's take a quick look at how the other pieces move. We're going to go ahead and start with the rook. You have a total of 2 rooks, one on each side that you see here. At the beginning of the game, you can't really move the rooks because they are walled off by your other pieces. But as the game progresses and you have enough room, the rooks will start to become key players in your game. A rook moves only either vertically, meaning the rook can go any number of squares straight, or the rook can go horizontally as far as it wants within the board. Now, but the rook cannot jump over other pieces. For example, if you have your pawn in the way here and you want to move your rook here, then what you would need to do is you would need to move your rook here. Then you would have to move your rook down or up in a straight fashion, and then you would have to move your rook here, and you would have to move your rook here. Whenever you're moving pieces around the board in such a manner, you also have to figure out how many steps is it going to take me to get the rook from here to here. You have to say, okay, 1, 2, 3, 4. Took 4 turns to move the rook from here to here. So if it's a very necessary move for you to do, you might want to consider that. But can we achieve moving the rook from here to here quicker? Yes, if we do the first move at moving the pawn here, then we can, in our next move the rook here, so that's only 2 moves. However, in a situation where maybe we have the opponent's pawn here, and this may not be possible, then, we might have to look for alternative ways to get your rook here. The rook captures also in a straight fashion. When we've seen that the pawns can capture diagonally, they cannot capture like this. They only have to capture diagonally. The rook can capture straight, or the rook can capture sideways. For example, if we had this scenario, the rook can capture the piece, and when it captures the piece, it goes on the spot where the opponent's piece was, takes that piece off the board, and now your piece is there. Whenever you decide to capture the opponent's piece, you always have to keep in mind that there's a possibility that the opponent's piece might also be protected. So in this particular scenario, the opponent's piece is not protected by any of the opponent's army, so you can capture it. Now that we've covered the rook a little bit, let's go ahead and jump into covering the movement of the knight. That we see here, we have a total of 2 knights, 1 on each side, and the opponent has 2 knights, 1 on each side. The knights have the most unusual movement. They move 2 squares forward and 1 square to the side, either this side or this side. The knight can also go 1 square and 2 squares to the side. So it creates this, or it can go down 1 to the side, or it can go up 2 to the side, or it can go down 2 to the side, or it can go down 2 to this side. Basically in a letter L. It's the most unusual one, and in some situations the movement of the knight takes a little bit of practice to remember. Also, seeing how the knight moves is also very important, because as we're playing the game, we always want to see where our knight sits and what squares it can capture and what squares it can protect. A knight sitting here is a great position for the knight, because the knight can go here, 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 and I'm going to run out of these little, and the knight can go on this square and this square. If I had 2 more stars, I would have put them here and here. As you can see, knight can go in any of these squares and these 2. One of the pretty awesome things about a knight is that the knight can jump over pieces, your pieces or the opponent's pieces. So in the very beginning, it can jump over your pawns. That's the only piece, is the knight. They can jump over and start the game immediately, whereas all of your other pieces are still kind of stuck behind the pawns. The knight can go ahead and jump out and start playing right away if you wanted to play that way. It can also jump over the opponent's pieces in any way, and the way that a knight captures is the same way that the knight moves, meaning the knight captures 2 to the side, 1 down, like this, or the knight can capture 2 up, like this, or the knight can capture 1 down to the side. So basically, that's how it moves. It moves either 1 down, 1 up, 1 to the side, and then 2 from that point, or it can go 2, 2, 2, 2, and 1. So it takes a little bit of practice if you haven't played chess to learn how to move the knight, but ultimately I think the knight is considered the most versatile piece on the board, because it has so much room to jump around, and it's a lot of times really hard to capture the opponent's knight, as it has so much room, especially towards the end of the game when there's so much room and all of the pieces are gone, or most of the pieces are gone. If the opponent has a knight, that's why the 3.2 points versus a 2.8 for the bishop, because sometimes it's really hard to capture the opponent's knight. It can move around the board every which way, and sometimes it can cause a lot of trouble. Just because it jumps around, what may seem like the knight doesn't have a lot of, it doesn't move a whole lot compared to maybe like a rook. A rook can go all the way to the other side of the board, like this. The knight can only move a little bit, but in 2 moves, the knight can move a substantial amount, substantial amount of space. In 2 moves, it can almost move throughout the entire board. Which that's what makes the knight so kind of frightening. It's such a strong piece, especially towards the end of the game. Okay, now that we've seen how the knight moves and how the knight captures, let's take a look at how this bishop moves and how it captures. A bishop that we see here, just like the rook, also cannot jump over your pieces or the opponent's pieces. But the way that a bishop moves is the bishop moves diagonally. The bishop moves diagonally, like this. The bishop cannot go straight, like the rook. It cannot go straight. It can only go diagonally. So you can be here, and you can move your bishop this way. You can be here, and you could move your bishop two points. If there was more space, for example, like this, you can move them further. The bishop can go here, it can go here, it can go any number of squares, but the bishop only stays on the diagonal. in the game of chess, you have two bishops. You have the light squared bishop and the dark squared bishop. This bishop stays on the dark squares. It will stay on the dark squares the entire game because the bishop only moves diagonally, it cannot switch from the light squares to the dark squares. And that's why they call them the light square bishop and dark square bishops. Bishops are great pieces to protect. Bishops protect the board. They can protect entire diagonals. They can be placed in the beginning of the game in, for example, this square. As long as you're protecting your piece, it can sit there and it can sort of keep an eye out for all of the white squares on this diagonal throughout the game. And that means that by placing your bishop in such a way, you can help to create some pressure where the opponent now must be careful as far as what pieces they're going to put on these squares. Towards the end of the game, the bishop, your bishop or the opponent's bishop, may or may not be as powerful of a piece, because if it's at the end of the game and we only have a few pieces left, and let's say the opponent has their bishop left and maybe their king, all I have to do is position my pieces on the other squares. If they have for example, a dark square bishop left, as we see here, and I have some pawns left, all I have to do is keep my pawns on the other color, because then if I do that, the bishop cannot capture these pawns. It's going to move in a diagonal fashion like this, and it can't do much, unless, of course, I put my pawn on that square. But a lot of times, the bishop may not be as powerful of a piece towards the end of the game. However, in the beginning of the game and middle of the game, the bishops are very effective at both protecting your pieces and also attacking the opponent's piece. Now that we talked a little bit about the bishop, let's take a quick look at the queen. The queen is considered the most powerful and versatile piece in the chess game, and its value system is valued at 10 points, which is the most for any of the pieces. The queen can either move like a rook, so it can move straight, or it can go up as far as it can. It cannot jump over pieces. The only piece that can jump over pieces is the knight. Or the queen can go diagonally. So the queen can go diagonally, or it can go straight, or it can go diagonally again. So it's kind of a combination of the rook and the bishop as far as the functionality. Not only can the queen go diagonally like the bishop, the queen is not restricted to going only on the certain color squares because it can move pretty much anywhere. The queen cannot go in an L shape like the knight. That is only the movement that's allowed for the knight. But the queen can move very far, and it can attack a number of pieces at once. Lastly, we have the king. The king that we see here in its initial position can only move one square at a time. It cannot jump over other pieces. So let's say that your king is here. It can move in any of these squares, one square at a time. So I can move here. That would be the end of my turn. And then I can move here. That would be the end of that turn. I can move back if I wanted to. I can move here. So the king is the most valuable piece, because if the king was captured, the game would be over. However, it's not a very strong piece. It's a little bit stronger than a pawn, but it's not a very strong piece. The king can capture the opponent's piece this way, or it can capture the opponent's piece sideways, just like it moves. Or it can capture the opponent's piece behind. So it can capture the opponent's piece in any way. However, the king also cannot go in a space where it's going to be checked. And what does that mean? Here we see that the opponent's pawn is taken off by one square. And right now, that opponent's pawn is basically looking at this diagonal square, and it's controlling that square. Controlling that square, it's preventing, you from basically moving your king here, because if you moved your king here, the king would be under attack, and that is not an allowed move. So if, for example, you are looking to capture this pawn, you cannot go here and then capture this way, because if you were to go here, you would be under attack and you cannot make that move, okay? So the king, in order to capture this pawn, would have to go this way first, and then on its next move, second move, it can take the pawn if the pawn is not protected. Now in this particular situation, the bishop was sitting here and the bishop is protecting the pawn. But let's say that this was not the case, then the king could come over here and take off this pawn off the board. Another rule about the king is that you cannot bring your king this close to another king. You always have to be one square away from the opponent's king. So if the opponent's king was here, you cannot move here, you cannot move here, and neither can the opponent's king. The opponent's king cannot go here or not go here. That is just not allowed, because if you were to go here, then you would be attacking the opponent's, you would be attacking this king, and this king would be attacking this king, and that is just not allowed. Which means that they're sort of like magnets, and they repel each other. You can only be one square away from the opponents. So the bishop and the knight and the rook on this side move exactly the same way as the bishop, the knight, and the rook on this side. Now, as I've mentioned before in this video, the objective of the game, to win the game, you have to checkmate the opponent's king. The opponent's king in the beginning of the game, and so is your king, are protected and they're situated in their corresponding spots. Now, if you found a way to checkmate the opponent's king early in the game, then the game is over. An example of that would be something like scholar's mate. So the scholar's mate goes something like this. You take out your first piece, your pawn. The opponent takes out their pawn pretty much the same way you did. You take out your bishop here. That bishop being taken out here is basically eyeing this piece here. It's now wanting to take over and capture this pawn, but currently it cannot do that because this pawn is protected by the king. Let's say, for example, the opponent's next move is here, as maybe the opponent decides they want to take out their knight to protect their pawn and get some other developments going. Then you take out your, for example, queen here, or you can take out your queen and put it here, for instance. That would be considered something like a scholar's mate. Let's say the opponent's next move was here and wanted to protect their pawn here. Well, now that we see that the bishop here is eyeing this piece, but this piece is protected by the king, but our other piece right here is also eyeing this piece. We have two pieces, and in such a way you can capture the opponent's pawn, and in this case the game is over because the opponent's king, as we've discussed earlier, is under attack by the queen, because the queen is sitting next to the king and it's attacking the king, and the king cannot escape the attack. What I mean by that, it cannot take the queen like this, because the queen is so finely protected by the bishop here, is protecting the queen from being eaten by the king or captured. The king is under attack, but it cannot move anywhere, because by moving anywhere, it's still going to be under attack. If it were to move here, it would still be under attack. If it were to be moved here, it would still be under attack. This is a very rudimentary example of the fact that you don't have to play a very big, long, elaborate game where you're exchanging all the pieces and getting to an end game if you've played this colors mate. The game is over. If you were the light pieces in this situation, you've won the game. Surprisingly, even having been on many different tournaments, sometimes you fall for this because, and I don't mean fall for it, but I've had a situation where I lost the game during a tournament to something like this. And you feel kind of silly a little bit because you or I should have been seeing this kind of opening going on, and I should have been more cognizant of the fact that when the opponent takes out their bishop on the second move, that you have to be already kind of aware that they might take out their queen, and then you have to be aware when they do that, you cannot leave this unprotected. So you have to now protect it with another piece. For example, this piece. I know we're kind of getting more into the game, and I'd love to discuss more of it, but these videos are going to get extensively long. So if we continue doing this, I would like to split this into another video. But so far in this video, hopefully I was able to show you guys best way I could how to move the pieces, the basic objective of the game, and if you are very new to chess, hopefully this video was helpful. If this video was helpful to you guys, please hit that like button, and if you have not yet subscribed to the channel, please do so. So that way more people can see this tutorial video, more people can benefit from it. In my next video, hopefully if you guys have enjoyed this, I can start talking more fine details about what I consider when I'm playing my games, some of the nuances and stuff that might be helpful not only for the beginners, but also for people that have already played chess for a while. With that being said, hopefully everybody enjoyed this video, and if you have, please stick around for the next video. I'll see you guys next time.